Welcome, everyone, to the Prince Alwaleed bin Talal bin Abdulaziz Alsaud Center for American Studies and Research. This is our last event for the semester, and it's really a great pleasure to have a good friend and brilliant scholar, Chris Newfield, here to talk to us about an issue of probably burning consideration in many universities, including this one. Chris Newfield is a professor of literature and American studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and his main current areas of research are literary knowledge and critical university studies. His books include Mapping Multiculturalism, which he edited with Avery Gordon, The Emerson Effect, Individualism and Submission in America, Ivy and Industry, Business and the Making of the American University, 1880 to 1980, and The Unmaking of the Public University, the 40-year assault on the middle class. His writings also cover American political psychology, race relations, science studies, the future of solar energy, and humanities-based approaches to economics. He teaches courses on detective fiction, California noir, innovative studies, critical theory, the future of higher education, and English majoring after college, and among others. And he blogs on higher education, funding, and policy at his own blog, Remaking the University. Do I need to say more? No, I think that's good. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Chris Newfield.
Thanks. Is this working? Okay. I'm really pleased to be here. I mean, this is not only do I love Lisa and been around for a while, and I just met Patrick at a conference recently and some other folks today, but AUB is really a legendary place, for student movements and protests, and for also, this is something I'm going to talk about a little bit about today, for modeling a kind of university that many people in the US associate with the past and with elites, and which I think is quite the opposite of that. It's something that should be extended to everybody, to sort of the working masses of every society. And I think it's very much the future. So I'm going to be saying something about why. And I guess the other preliminary thing I'm going to say before I read a paper, which, believe it or not, is actually faster than me because I get kind of chatty just talking to you, is that a lot of the way that things are coming out now in the US with cuts to public funding for universities and with the kind of the glorification is not really the word, but a lot of support for a sense of inevitability about the gradual privatization of public universities, that is, moving to a student tuition funding basis and away from sort of general taxpayer funding and so on. A lot of the way that it's coming out now has to do with the fact that one of the teams has not really taken the field with sort of complete enthusiasm. And by that I mean that starting 40 years ago, the right became very active, the political right in the United States, in trying to explain to regular Americans that universities were now being launched, were now being used as sort of safe havens, with gates and walls, to launch attacks on society and on American values and on capitalism, the free enterprise system as it was often called then. And so universities had to be brought to heel, and they brilliantly succeeded at a series of campaigns that have delegitimized certain kinds of knowledge, progressive knowledge, identity-based knowledge, identity politics so-called, so that campaigns like Black Lives Matter, which are increasingly active on college campuses, are seen as politics rather than knowledge production, even though the truth is it was kind of the reverse. A lot of American sociology and social history were informed by social movements rather than sort of the other way around. In other words, the shells are being lobbed into from the outside rather than the other way around. Knowledge shells. I guess that's really not the metaphor that I want. So the right's been very active, and the center has essentially taken over universities on the management level, doing a lot of good things, but also really feeling like they have to work inside a framework of understanding of the function of the university that is essentially that of conservatives. That is, that economic goals are primary, and so I'm going to talk more about this, so I won't say much about it. The people that are missing are the left. The left has focused on urgent issues like anti-racism, and I think these are important. They're absolutely essential for folks to continue to exert their energy on. But the terrain on which these struggles are being waged has been taken away conceptually from the left. And so part of what I'm trying to do today is argue that sort of the traditional core of the understanding of what universities are is something that has to be recaptured by center left, by the left, in a long sort of negotiation with itself about what a humanistic and a socially oriented university needs to look like. The other thing that I'll just say in a preliminary way is that there's a fair amount of detail in the talk that I'm about to give you, and the reason for that is that I don't think we can say neoliberal university, obviously a problem, or neoliberal university, it's inevitable, or neoliberal university, it's good, which are kind of the three positions that we have. We have to drill into what that actually means and either agree with it and support it or actually contest it in a meaningful way. So today I'm offering some details about that, and here's kind of the march that we're going to do. So I think it's important to have a basis for understanding at least what the American model of the public university is, which is absolutely not neoliberal, even though it was profoundly capitalist and militaristic in a lot of ways. Talk about the difference between a knowledge society and a knowledge economy. And then three is kind of what I think is important, which is looking at what neoliberalism actually, what its working parts are, so that then we can get to part four, which is, showing how they're actually screwing up the university that they're trying to stabilize when they neoliberalize it. That's basically my argument. And then finally, I'll say some very brief things about what comes after, where these conflicts, where I hope there are more players in the near future, might actually end up leading. Okay, so the first thing, the meaning of the public university. All right, so one source of the idea, at least for me, was the public ethos of the US university after World War II. It was specifically the ethos, again, not just an idea or an ideology, but kind of a social sense. As it underwent a massive expansion to incorporate returning war veterans back into American society, to defuse the social movements of the 1930s, particularly the labor movement, and to expand research relevant to both economic and military competition with the communist world during the Cold War. So it's a range of projects. What did these elements add up to? In the early 1960s, the already renowned University of California president Clark Kerr, which here he is on the cover of Time magazine, popularized a term for this kind of post-war country. It was an information society, he said, or a knowledge society. The knowledge society had one indispensable institution, that was the research university. Kerr called this the multi-university, but also called it the city of intellect. He wrote this: "The city of intellect may be viewed in a broader context encompassing all the intellectual resources of a society and the even broader perspective of the force of intellect as the central force of a society, its soul. Will it, the city of intellect, be the salvation of our society?" This is the question that he poses in this book. Was Kerr a kind of Cold War Humboldt, thinking of the founders of the German university during the German Enlightenment of the late 18th century? The answer to this is yes and no. But note the inclusion of all the fields in this quotation, and note also the confidence, the certainty of the power of the forces of intellect as they forge what we might think of as the unfolding of the historical destiny of mankind. For Kerr and many others, the university intellect must transform the mode of production into freedom, expressed for him as middle-class democracy. One major means for doing this was, of course, military and corporate technoscience. World War II and then the Cold War flooded American universities with money. A second means consisted of the social sciences and humanities, which may find their particular roles in helping to define the good as well as the true, and to add wisdom to truth. End quote. The third means was a campaign for growing the university, was a campaign to convince the general public that its aspirations required strong universities. Kerr and others fought agonizing political battles on behalf of this vision of the public university. What enabled them to be willing to fight and to win for a time? Okay, there were two sources of this policy activism. Okay, first, they built the university as a public good for the full spectrum of a democratic society. In 1945, 10 to 20 mostly private universities continued to control most research revenues and elite social networks as they had since the 19th century. The arrival of demobilized soldiers on campuses through the GI Bill turned a much larger number of universities into national players. They not only had more money, they had a popular, though generally implicit, public mission. Public meant three things as the concept evolved through the 1950s and 1960s into the 1970s. First was mass access. The term access meant that you could afford to go and wouldn't run up debt. Access meant more fundamentally that you could get into the public university, that you would actually be admitted into it. UC campuses were all close to open in admission into the early 70s, and most accepted all applicants who met baseline requirements, which is not the case, say, at Berkeley today. It's just hard to get in. It's like a 20% acceptance rate, as it was to get into Harvard 25 or 30 years ago. Okay. Second, the public in public universities meant mass quality. The great flagships, Ann Arbor, Austin, Berkeley, Bloomington, et cetera, did not take a back seat in quality to Ivy League universities, but competed with them, and in emerging fields in particular, often won. The publics offered competitive quality on a scale that private universities could not match and never would. That was in research. In teaching, the public idea was to elevate the individual capabilities of huge numbers of students. Public universities didn't reject everyone who wasn't already on a high level. They took nearly all comers and then improved them after they got in. I mean, no offense to Stanford or Harvard, but these universities minimize their public impact by accepting and improving only those students who are already at the top of the achievement pyramid before they've attended their first class. In contrast, there's been enormous public impact in taking mid-level achievers and making them good or great. Mass quality in public universities has meant reducing the mediocrity of the masses, taking the vast majority of we allegedly mediocre folks and our middling backgrounds, average levels of ambition, and not so great personal focus, and making us really good at some things. Mass quality has consisted implicitly of Bildung, of personal development on an unprecedented scale. Of course, this was presumed to lead to economic development as the moral land grant legislation demanded and as politicians invariably insist upon. But the means, and also the tacit end, was instruction that combined subject mastery with individual cultivation. When they functioned well, public universities taught content while doing liberal arts style work on what we might now call creative capabilities, adapting work by Martha Nussbaum and others. Universities also furnished the concepts and created the conditions for the identity politics revolution often associated with Michel Foucault's and Judith Butler's work on the fluidity of gender, as well as sexuality, et cetera. I mean, there's really a renaissance that took place on this basis. In any of these cases, intellectual content and personal identity were addressed together in a combination of great public power. Okay, third, the public in public universities meant sociocultural inclusion. Women, people of color, and religious minorities were included and sometimes actively welcomed and valued. The most important form of integration was racial, but in a land with what one recent cultural geographer calls the 11 nations of North America, public universities also established baseline conditions of general cross-cultural equality. Assimilation to WASP norms became decreasingly the university's operative assumption. This was a long, slow road, and we are nowhere near the end of it. We still have ongoing problems of racial climate on campuses coast to coast, as various rebellions going on even this week in the US signal, as well as gender trouble indicated by the national debate about sexual assault on campus that is also going on. But the goal of racial equality persisted as a kind of a double bind. The university could not fulfill an egalitarian vision. It's, capitalist America. Yet it could not settle for not fulfilling it. Public did start to mean anti-exclusion on the basis of race, culture, or other identities, with the outcome being the possibility for the first time in US history of a solidarity society formed by what we now call the 99%. Okay, so here's a summary chart of what I just said that shows from left to right social challenges in the 1950s and 1960s, then the traditional mainstream sort of middle class position, the public university's general, though usually implicit stance, because you sort of downplayed this so you wouldn't create too much of a reaction against it. And then finally, and I think this is a kind of quiet revolution in American society that conservatives really wanted to stop by the 1970s, and that is this I don't know what you'd call it, just a non-conservative middle class that was, embodied in people's children coming home from Berkeley or coming home from Cal State Northridge or coming home from El Camino City College with ideas that they absolutely had not learned at home and that were in fact antithetical to what they had been taught. Okay, so the US faced challenges in the political, economic, and cultural domains, so these are the rows. By the 1960s, traditional conservatism no longer offered functional responses, even though the majority of the middle class remained sort of culturally loyal to them. So my claim here, which I argued at length in this book, Unmaking the Public University, is that the public university offered meaningful problem solving in these three dimensions, where the political right and center were actually failing. The society imagined by this non-conservative middle class, I wouldn't call it progressive, but it's not anchored in the way that it had been before, represented a major expansion of democracy, or at least democratic potential in these zones, democratic imagination. The mass white-collar middle class, or what John Kenneth Galbraith called in the 1960s the technostructure, began to take for granted a kind of bourgeois labor theory of value that entitled it to much of the process and proceeds of the new wealth they traced back to their own expertise. Okay, so the first reason for the post-war public university's success was its public good pursuit of democracy in these three dimensions. The second reason was that this kind of knowledge democracy fit with the way business and political elites understood the knowledge society. The crux was that all but the most right-wing elites agreed that capitalist society had to be a knowledge society. The reason was simple. Capitalism required innovation. Innovation needed to be continuous. To be continuous, innovation needed to be widespread. So the theory of the knowledge society argued that while an earlier capitalism had a long-running engagement with exploitation, slavery, imperialism, and the like, a mature capitalism that post-war America was trying to embody would create value through invention. Okay, that required public universities because they offered the mass production of the human capability of creation. Okay, so this was an idealization of post-war capitalism, which in the 1950s was escalating foreign interventions in the Middle East, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, just to name three regions. And yet it was an idealization with society-building powers. Its visual representation of the public university system has been handed down to us, this is the California version, by the photographer Ansel Adams, who was commissioned to do a centennial book by Clark Kerr in the early 1960s about the country's leading public research university system. And this is what some of his photographs look like. So this is Ansel Adams. There were sort of the traditional old world spaces at Berkeley, so literally the ivory tower. There's the cultural fusion at UCLA. It's a kind of Spanish, Moorish, Mexican, democratic, imperial something. Okay, at the Davis campus, the present is already a Martian chronicle. San Diego, the university without walls, open to the four winds, creating something new with the energy that was always rushing through. And then Irvine, just So basically the whole campus is lowered onto the barren Orange County Piedmont by black helicopters from the Planet of the Apes. And then finally there's Irvine 2, which is space and no final frontier. It's like the whole planet as the USS Enterprise. And then more locally, the first picture that I took when I got here yesterday at Ghazian University with the Lebanese space program signaled in the front. This is a very small university. The point here is just, it can be scaled to the size of the country, but the aspiration was similar. I mean, not the military side of this, which is not how it started, but you know, the vision of the tomorrow that everybody's going to build together. You know, the Jetsons, something. Okay. So from the knowledge society to the knowledge economy, this is the second part, and I'm gonna rush this a bit. As it turned out, Clark Kerr's presidency was the beginning of the end of this knowledge society and its public good mega university. Here, since this is really the setting, so I'll back it up to that. A local Cold Warrior named Ronald Reagan ran against a popular governor in 1966 in California by redefining Berkeley's city of intellect as the city of subversion. Reagan won and fired Clark Kerr in 1967. The American political right, as I said at the start, has waged culture wars and budget wars on universities ever since. The core conservative claim hasn't changed in the subsequent 50 years. The university's development of three-dimensional democracy is an attack on American power, the claim is, on American affluence, on the American business system. After a half century of steady effort, this framing has succeeded at its core goal, which was to sever the university from its popular base as the servant of everybody's personal as well as vocational aspiration. The general public still expects the university to be there to help when, as the novelist Pro Bronson once put it, society is caught in an infinite loop and has stopped responding. But these expectations for universities have shifted to its contribution to a knowledge economy. Okay. A knowledge economy is something quite different from a knowledge society. The knowledge society assumed the vast majority of the society would participate in capitalist innovation, which had an economic outcome, but a democratic, participatory intellectual means. The knowledge society includes everyone and everything connected to the application of information, all the employees who use information at work, and also the public and private institutions that support them. This concept was too limited as a description of actual society in 1970 or 2015. It excluded blue-collar workers, for example, in factories, but it covered the millions of undergraduates that American universities were already releasing into the workforce in the post-war years. In contrast, the knowledge economy, which is basically what we're all living in now, is based in what we call the tech industries and the small number of mostly science and technology workers and bankers and managers who are seen to add value directly to the high-tech economy. A knowledge economy seeks returns from advanced technology that is always created, patented, developed, and marketed by a technical elite. The knowledge economy needs only a very specific range of sociocultural thinking that sometimes goes by the name of design thinking. This can be learned by the small numbers of people who can access lavish educational resources at, in the United States, the familiar group of 16 to 24 universities, nearly all of which were already on top in the year 1900. A knowledge economy detaches sociocultural knowledge from the social world and reinforces wealth creation as an autonomous and dominant driver of social policy. The knowledge economy separates sociocultural from economic thought, or what we call in the States non-STEM, science, technology, engineering and mathematics, from STEM subjects. And in the second move, it elevates the latter to the dominant position. Financial self-interest has become a higher form of practical reason that undergirds entrepreneurship and controls our era's master narrative. That last sentence, I think that there's a whole historical game just in higher, financial self-interest has become a higher form of practical reason. It's kind of like management has become a form of universal reason in the Kantian sense. and others are partial forms. Politics is a partial form and an inferior form of that in this knowledge economy structure. And that entrepreneurship in sort of the Schumpeterian sense, the Haeckian sense, becomes the driver of all possible progress. There is no progress through politics, culture, et cetera. Lexus versus the olive tree, right? So religious beliefs, et cetera, are the thing you have to basically chop down in order to get the fuel to get your Lexus and moving into the future. It's the bad Jetsons, I guess, as opposed to the good version. So anyway, there's more to be said about this, but I think the thing that's important to realize about the period where the knowledge society was the dominant formation is that it was also a period of kind of popular knowledge getting into technical spheres. And the example that really sticks in my mind, because I remember riding my bike to school for one of the first Earth days, was the Love Canal toxic disaster, which created basically the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States and was one of the first large-scale environmental remediation projects in the US. It was both discovered and put on the political map and then funded entirely because of the inexhaustible energy of a bunch of housewives who lived in this forgotten suburb next to what had been a factory that produced the toxins that they figured out were giving their children illnesses, including cancer. And the kind of amazing thing about it is that they became toxicologists. They hired people, they taught themselves. This is the kind of thing that was is a more spontaneously obvious human capability, that how mom can go out to the library, read some stuff, try to find somebody at a city agency that will talk to her, and take it from there to the point of going to city council, agitating finally the governor of the state, and so on. In a knowledge economy, those people, they're downstream of the tech production process. You just don't need them. And when they get involved, they make things worse rather than better. And even though funding agencies in the US are trying to cut against this and requiring public engagement with regular folks, it's still top down in a way that makes me feel like we lost a kind of a general cultural understanding that was part of this Clark Kerr period, even though Kerr was himself no rebel. All right, so the effect of the shift from the knowledge society to the knowledge economy. See what happens when I start chatting with you? That's going to have to stand as the example. I'm going to move forward to the next section. Okay, so the last thing I want to say about this is the United States, in fact, declining from its status as a knowledge society into something more like a traditional power society, which I'm suggesting, or in this thing I just skipped, is compatible with a knowledge economy. In other words, you can have a Game of Thrones political order with high tech, as well as with the low tech that you see on, neo-medieval shows like that. And if so, what can the university do? Are we powerless bystanders, or are there things that we can do to try to shift the cultural consensus back? All right, so this gets us to 4 features of the current consensus, the third section. What American universities can do is conditioned by what they have done. So we're starting in a hole. What they have done has been to adapt to these conditions of the neoliberal knowledge economy. The common claim that universities resist change is the opposite of the case. American universities have in fact been shifting their core social mission for 30 years. They have helped lead the shift from the knowledge society to the knowledge economy. In the process, the university has shifted from providing, here's my sacred term, general development, to providing the term I'm trying to discredit, disruptive innovation, which is sort of at the center of American economic tech thinking today. This has meant a narrowing from developing sociocultural knowledge to offering measurable economic benefits. It has included a shift from the public to the private mission and has propelled and been propelled by privatization. These are momentous shifts. They are associated with these terms I've been avoiding so far: privatization, corporatization, marketization, and neoliberalism. So I'm going to try to get behind these terms because I think they sometimes obscure as much as they reveal. Okay, so there are 4 key axioms supporting the current consensus neoliberal view. The first is the idea that universities especially public universities, suffer from a cost disease, that they are simply unable to keep their operating costs from going up all the time. The concept of cost disease goes back to a 1966 paper by the economists William Baumol and William Bowen. The main argument is that costs fall over time in manufacturing because it can replace labor with technology. But labor-intensive industries will not lower their costs in the same way. Labor-intensive industries include nearly all service industries, elder care, preschools, hair salons, and universities. Baumol and Bowen's example was a string quartet. You always need 4 people in a quartet and can't cut costs by playing a quartet with 3. Education and healthcare are 2 sectors that have always been put in the same category. They are labor-intensive, hands-on, and require human responsiveness and personal judgment. Academic labor is seen as particularly expensive. Tenured faculty make salaries well above the national average and can't be disciplined through the threat of layoffs, which is the go-to cost solution in American corporate culture. Okay, so this axiom, this first one, has 2 outcomes. The first is to impose the classic strategy of technological disruption, introduce new technology into the workplace that can replace human labor and allegedly do a better job than the human was doing in the first place. This was the double contention that drove the MOOC craze of 2012 and 13 in the US, massive open online courses. The idea was that the professional skills of professors are grossly overrated, and online courses can save a lot of money without a real loss in quality. These claims turned out to be false, but they were propelled beyond the reach of evidence by a Schumpeterian vision in which human labor must eventually always be replaced by technology for the sake of curing the cost disease and liberating the creation of wealth. Okay, the further outcome of the belief is in the university's cost disease is the need for managerial muscle to implement change against the self-interest of professional academics. Thus, universities are being subject to new levels of managerialism, particularly in the United Kingdom, which is there to implement disruptive innovation. It is also the main source of administrative bloat, which ironically ensures that university costs increase. The analysis of the cost disease expects technology to replace labor and for this replacement to be controlled by relatively top-down management, which is of course very expensive, which basically proves the thesis that management is there to prove in the first place, which is that university costs constantly go up. Okay, so I've made another little chart for you. So here's the first one, the first axiom. The second axiom overlaps with the first. It holds that technological and scientific fields are superior to the arts, humanities, and social sciences fields, superior both economically and intellectually. Not only do what we call the STEM fields make all the money, but they also produce, in this theory, all the valid knowledge. Okay, what I call the SASH fields, which is like rearranging social sciences, arts, and humanities, are often seen as good for students who couldn't make it in the sciences, or good for teaching cultural appreciation, or good for offering basic skills like clear writing, but not good for generating real knowledge. Ironically, the social sciences in their turn look down on the humanities. This is basically the same reason. Okay, just one anecdote. One of my department's literature graduate students took a sociology seminar in Lisa's department back at UCSB on climate and society. The last assigned reading was a novel, and the literature grad student reported to me that the Soc professor said, well, this is a fun way to end the quarter, but you can't really learn anything about society by reading a novel. This is cum. Oh, cut that part too. So it was essentially there for entertainment, and the Soc students, to the horror of the literature grad student, agreed with this. That's true, so let's talk about our favorite parts, and then we'll move on to the sociological part of the class. Okay, the consensus view sees arts and humanities fields as having mostly personal value. Since they have so little value for the economy, they should therefore be paid for by the consumer. The extreme example of this view is the Tory government that was just re-elected in Britain. Since 2011, it has cut central funding for all university teaching by 80% and has reduced funding for the arts and humanities nearly to zero. Okay, so there's the second one. The third axiom is university research, though largely funded through government, achieves its main value through commercialization. Researchers disclose inventions, patent them, and license the patents to companies that develop them into products for the general marketplace. Intellectual property rights incentivize the transfer of knowledge to society via private firms and market forces. Although research has social value, what we sometimes call the linear model of innovation that I'm describing here requires that research exit through the private sector. The value of university research becomes defined as its value to the private sector and is informally equated in policy discourse with a private market value. This is important also for fundraising because it's bait for potential donors who want to see, well, what's the return on my investment if I give you £1 million or dollars or whatever it is? What's going to come out of that you can support yourself with in terms of money? And so this linear model, even though it's incorrect, is often said, well, this is what we're going to do. You give us $1 million, we'll put it into engineering, and we're going to multiply that investment by a lot. Okay, so the fourth axiom is like the third, only applied to teaching rather than to research. University education is mainly a private good for its graduates. A bachelor's degree offers a wage premium over high school. Students go to university to invest in their higher future earnings. Since the obvious quantifiable effect of a bachelor's degree is higher lifetime earnings, it makes sense that students should pay more than society does, in this argument. The degree is an investment in a future return in the form of better pay. This axiom is used to justify the astonishing level of student debt in the United States. Debt inhibits college completion and is now being recognized by the business community as a drag on an economy that depends on younger consumers buying expensive things. But if university is a private good, then debt is just a normal investment in one's own future superior earnings. Okay, so we have these four axioms that create the current consensus paradigm. There's a cost disease, there's STEM superiority, there's research for commerce, and there's bachelor's degrees as private goods. And together, they create one major conclusion, and this is particularly important really in the US and the UK, and probably here, although some of you may want to talk about more than me. The conclusion is public universities don't really need public funding anymore. Since universities produce private goods for students and business through technology, commercialization, and workforce skilling, it's best to implement private sector practices for the sake of efficiency and increased unit output. Universities do not, in this consensus view, have a unique, specific modality or knowledge ecology that must remain independent of the state or the corporation. These post-war effects I discussed earlier, participatory democracy, middle-class affluence, cultural integration, were public goods. But in the current paradigm, they are either unimportant or actually opposed to innovation and to wealth creation itself. This consensus paradigm authorizes governments to cut public funding and shifts most costs onto students and their families. Some public funding will always remain because every business sector seeks public subsidies and the main ones always receive them. But most core costs in this view can and should be covered with student tuition and student loans. So this thing that I've just presented is an internally consistent and ideologically powerful framework within which discussions of the American university now take place. The framework offers a narrow range of fiscal outcomes. The whole funding game is now played solidly at midfield with the principles of student tuition and student debt firmly established. So we're going to raise tuition 5% or 7%. Are we going to increase public funding 3% or 4%? It's all just tiny stuff that won't make any difference at all, and it's not supporting the level of major aspiration that we saw in those post-war years. Okay, the point about this, though, is leading to this claim that privatization works, is that this framework is fundamentally flawed. Its flaws are most apparent in its practical effects. It delivers permanent austerity to US public universities. It increases inequality between the top privates and everybody else. The framework locks in student debt, particularly for low-income students. The framework is part of a larger socio-political movement away from post-war style democracy and away from post-war middle-class economics, even as college has become the ante into seeking middle-class status. So, I mean, I'd happily spend the rest of my time sort of detailing the social and political and cultural failings of this, but what I'm going to do instead is focus on this model's internal errors. For in addition to these and other visible external consequences, the consensus paradigm falsifies the basic nature and operation of universities as such. Each of the 4 axioms of the framework is quite wrong about the university itself. It is to the erroneous nature of each of the framework's axioms that I now turn. So I think it's important that we kind of like arm ourselves in a sense with this understanding of not just it's indebting students and hurting the younger generation, et cetera, which it is doing, but also just getting at the internal logic and the problems there. Okay, so first there's the idea that the university, particularly the public university, has a cost disease that it could cure with automation and technology. Our consensus paradigm does not acknowledge that universities in the US have in fact been cheapening their teaching labor for many decades. They have replaced tenure-track jobs with untenured or contingent jobs, which require more teaching work for less teaching pay and are a kind of sweatshop into which increasing numbers of PhDs are being injected. One new advocacy group, accurately called the New Faculty Majority, consists of non-tenured and part-time faculty. Here's an image of how the US university got there. So this is basically percentage change in numbers of employees over like a 40-year period in different categories. What you see is basically that contingent faculty who have no job security have grown at 10 times the rate of tenure-track faculty. And non-teaching professionals, which means basically all staff, sort of administration, have grown at an even higher multiple, right? Because can you see that? The full-time tenure and tenure-track faculty is 23% all the way down there. So executives, full-time contingent or adjunct faculty, part-time adjunct faculty, and administration have all grown at enormously greater rates, 10x in at least one case. What this shows is that universities have been trying to address their so-called labor cost disease for 40 years. Major teaching labor savings lie behind the university and not ahead. And importantly, keeping instructional payroll has not actually restrained overall university costs, because what's happened is payroll shifted out of the classroom and out of the laboratory and into, not so much the C-suite as just the cubicles, the many metabolic functioning processes that require large amounts of staff. The focus on cost diseases also had an unwanted effect that William Baumol himself recently described. He says, a reduction in the amount of time put into a personal service is likely to make the service worse, right, as opposed to a manufacturing activity. An increase in productivity in healthcare or education, that is, a rise in the number of patients or students treated or educated in a given amount of time, is difficult to attain without an accompanying decline in quality. And this is, in fact, exactly what has happened to the mass American university over the last decades of focus on the teaching cost disease. And here's a attainment chart. It basically says, well-to-do people, the top quarter, have indeed continued to increase their college participation. Everybody else is flat. And the poorest students who are the most in need of financial assistance and also social and cultural supports for getting a degree have stagnated. It's gone from 6.2 to a little over 10% in 40 years. I mean, it's quite a terrible record. So attainment is stagnated for the 3/4 of the population that goes to the regional 4-year and 2-year public universities that, because they have always been short of money, have mostly contingent teaching staff and offer more limited student services. US attainment has fallen behind internationally, where it now ranks 16th. The focus on cutting educational labor costs has not held down overall costs, but it has held down educational quality. In addition, the focus on costs has partially deprofessionalized the university faculty, weakening their institutional status and their public value. Okay, so the second axiom of our consensus is that, you don't want to look at that chart forever, do you? Axiom of our consensus is that real knowledge is quantitative knowledge, which comes mainly from the technosciences, but not from the arts, humanities, and qualitative social sciences. I mean, to me, this claim is self-evidently false. I mean, it's ridiculous to want to have a knowledge society without social and cultural knowledge. It's clear that every single public problem on Earth has a social, cultural, and psychological dimension, if not foundation. Chemists can invent cheap new antiviral treatments for AIDS in lower income countries and then have no idea why a lot of people refuse to take them. Military contractors can sell drones to local police departments to monitor civil unrest, but never address the social and psychological conditions, poverty, racism, over-policing, unaffordable community colleges, et cetera, that cause them. So basically, everyone in this room can immediately think of a problem on which over-focusing on technical aspects and neglecting the cultural or personal dimensions has prevented a real solution. So I'm not going to belabor this. But I do want to add one aspect that we should bear in mind, especially here where we're not sitting in the United States, and it concerns the traditional idea of development. Development, in the words of the anthropologist Henrietta Moore, has depended on exporting and imposing models with supposedly known outcomes as solution to the challenges faced in the global South. But if we focus on the future of prosperity, on broader understandings of human flourishing, rather than on economic development based on growth, we will have to accept that the prosperous societies of the future will be very diverse. For the principles of the good life or morality or values are all diverse, as are the definitions of success, well-being, sustainability, and aspiration. In such contexts as these, learning will not be about the transferability of whole models, at which I would add STEM excels, with known outcomes which STEM folks often assume is the test of valid knowledge, but rather about incomplete learning, experimentation, and collaboration. So Moore is asking Western universities and governments to support what has always been happening, post-imperial and non-colonial knowledge creation everywhere in the world. The moment of STEM dominance in academia is ironically the moment of the dominance of non-STEM sociocultural factors in global issues. This is the moment in which plural methodologies, the anti-reductionist grasp of context, and interpretive skill with ambiguous information will be at the center of intellectual progress on global issues. As it happens, working without models is a SASH specialty, and humanities skills are desperately needed to solve complex problems across non-converging environments. Democratic deliberation among conflicting groups depends on dozens of skills we think about as little as we think about how we are able to stay on a bicycle as we pedal down the street. And yet in the absence of these skills, we fall off the bicycle. In political life, democracy becomes political gridlock or civil war. Universities that cannot now shift resources into sociocultural knowledges will become irrelevant, which I think in many cases is what's happening. Okay, what about axiom number 3, that the value of research is realized by the private sector, so universities must hand scientific results off to business? In reality, most of the total value of research is dark matter with enormous indirect long-term impacts on society. These indirect and long-term impacts remain invisible to market valuations. Research mostly contributes to other research. Any given discovery has a negative present net market value. Since it costs a lot of money to achieve, its future value becomes positive only collectively in relation to many other related discoveries. At the same time, academic research has a very large non-market and social value. I mean, this was an insight developed in the 1950s during that Kerr period by neoclassical economists like Kenneth Arrow and Richard Nelson, who pointed out that only a fraction of the intellectual and human capital formed by knowledge creation could be quantified as a result, as a return on a specific investment. Evaluating university research through market returns will always produce underinvestment as the result of what they started to call market failure. Okay, so this older analysis, I mean, it's just become even more true than it was in the 50s, and it's actually not speculative. As public funding for research has stagnated or fallen in the US, and this is becoming actually kind of a crisis in the UK, where the Tory government that are here, huge business boosters, have presided collectively over the single largest decline in private sector investment in R&D in the past 20 or 30 years. What's happened in the United States is that as public support for research has declined in the same way, it fell another 9% in fiscal year 2013 in real dollars. Private industry has basically not stepped up there either. So here's a quick NSF chart just to show you. I'm kind of obsessed with this. I'll try to stop in a second. You'd think that, oh, well, so we can't rely on the public sphere in the same way, so we, the private sector, are going to step up because we are the primary beneficiaries under this kind of conceptual framework of the discoveries that are going to be passed to us, the private sector, as quickly as possible. And in fact, everywhere except, sort of famous places like China, business has been basically not stepping up at all. It's stayed in single digits as a share of university research. The reason is simple. They're like corporations are legally obligated to produce return on investments. You can't get a return on investment by plowing research into speculative, weird stuff, which is the stuff that produces the discoveries and realities of tomorrow. So it has to be funded publicly. Okay, so basically what's happened here is that the sort of a neoliberal university will produce lower investment in research and development and not higher, although the theory is that it will improve that. Okay, so finally there's the idea that a bachelor's degree is mainly a private good. This claim is, of course, flatly contradicted by the humanistic understanding of universities first developed by the German Enlightenment, where the university was defined as among history's most powerful public goods. The private good claim, though, interestingly, is also contradicted by education economics. One of the most remarkable recent works in this field was by a guy named Walter McMahon. It was called Higher Learning, Greater Good, which is a comprehensive, meticulous study of basically all of the impacts that going to university has. So while everyone knows about the private market payoff of college, students, parents, politicians, business leaders know next to nothing about these other categories that McMahon inserted into his analysis. And the book is like this, and it has at least, 50 statistical tables. So I don't recommend it if it's not your cup of tea, but I can summarize it at greater length if you're interested in the sort of the crib. Essentially what he says is that if you look at impacts like better control over family size, happiness indexes, cognitive development for one's children, ability to learn and upgrade employment later on in life, non-cash amenities at higher skilled jobs, reduced obsolescence of one's own human capital through that ability to learn, et cetera. What you find is that the non-market and the social value, total value of universities is 2/3 of it. That is that we talk about private market value, increased income, it's basically 1/3 of the total that even a very narrowly quantitative economist has come up with. And I think we could actually produce more than he did. Okay, so here's where we end up. The consensus paradigm, did that move? Yes, no. There. 2/3 is about ignored. The consensus paradigm expresses American common sense about its universities, and yet it is damaging those universities while also diminishing their social value. The consensus has lowered educational outcomes for most of the public university sector. The consensus has deprofessionalized the majority of the professoriate. The consensus has damaged the sociocultural fields that are indispensable to answering global questions. The consensus, by privatizing technological development, has reduced investment in basic research and deepened an innovation crisis. The consensus, by defining value through direct market outcomes, has understated the total value of college and encouraged public underinvestment. The university, its faculty, its students, and its host society have been hurt by the consensus paradigm. The consensus helps a small group of people within the knowledge economy, but it does enormous damage to the knowledge society. Okay, so what I want to do in closing is just say a few quick things about reversing each of those, and then we'll move on. Okay, so I think there's a couple of things that when we're thinking about where to go from here that we can eliminate out of hand. The first is continuing with this current course, which I described at the beginning as based on an alliance between the center and conservatives who continue to control the framing and produce, have pretty much locked in these four elements that I've been talking about. It's destructive, it's unsustainable. The second is that we can't return to the public university of Clark Kerr's post-war era. I mean, that in the States presumed an overwhelmingly white society in an economy that dominated the world order and could teach commodity skills on a mass scale for a corporate order that basically no longer exists. We can, however, take a cue from the success of the post-war university as a public good. Okay, we're going to fill in all these. Sorry, this is having trouble here at the end. Okay, we're going to fill in that whole column in the next 3 minutes. We can take a cue from the public good understanding of this. That university, the public university, brought surplus populations into the mainstream of the economy. It directed research funding towards public benefit. That university also satisfied the post-war demand for a personal life less driven by want and by psychological repression. Universities answered an often unspeakable demand for self-actualization, for pleasure, for altered states, for alternative realities, for new ways of being, for a better life world. Universities were seen by students from restricted conditions, African American, first generation, etc., as places of liberated imagination. So that sense of hope, that joy, is the only thing that will finally save the public university. It's a sense of play, of the ludic passions, of desublimation, of adventure that will allow it to solve the world's most oppressive problems. This can be achieved through these four reforms, none of which are particularly joyful in themselves, which I think lead to a synthesis that actually will be. And I'm just going to basically entitle them here. Okay, first, instead of endless instructional cost cutting, we need personalized, immersive instruction, which is why I said at the beginning that universities like AUB are the future, not the past. We will need to help students acquire complex skills that are suited to their individual interests and distinctive abilities so they can address the world's horribly difficult problems. This will mean more full-time faculty, smaller courses, and better use of technology to develop creative capabilities in subordination to the teacher-student relationship. The US is now beefing up community college, which is the weakest link in a routinized system. We need to de-routinize and offer creativity learning to the huge number of poor and underprepared students, not give them a slightly higher level of high school. Okay, second, rather than STEM dominance, we need to overcome the two cultures divide between the arts and sciences that is worse than when C.P. Snow first named it 55 years ago. This will involve a painful and contentious rebalancing of university budgets so that the SASH disciplines are not starved for research funds as they currently are. It will require new forms of cross-training, higher levels of numerical literacy in the arts and humanities, and collaboration across institutional barriers. It will also mean the qualitative disciplines taking up economic and social questions aggressively and moving on to quantitative turf. The SASH fields need to achieve new territorial occupations. The reward will be a rising generation that can see the connections among our problems' multiple dimensions. So the public good here is going to be very great. So I mean, I am talking about occupy, not occupying especially economic discussions, which have been the privileged domain of econ and poli-sci and a few other related fields, especially those coming out of business schools. Third, For technology, we need to free technological development from its private sector straitjacket. We need to move universities past the era of strong intellectual property rights in research and development. We are no longer getting the necessary results from the linear model in which the pipeline of invention runs from publicly funded basic research into the opaque tube of invention, discourse, patenting, licensing, and highly secretive development of a product by a private company focused on maximum benefits to itself. The technological imagination needs and deserves multiple pathways into public life, including placing inventions directly into the public domain for anyone to improve. Has failed to recognize and support the non-market public benefits of university teaching and research. It has burdened students with debt while squeezing research funds. It has misled the public and politicians about the meaning of learning. University benefits are mostly public and mostly collective. I am smarter because I have learned. I am smarter because you have learned. I am smarter because the unknown child in the poor family down the road has been able to learn. We can multiply these effects by the 1 billion or 2 billion people now engaged in some kind of formal education around the world. And I think we can do this with detailed critique and detailed alternatives, but we must do this because we are running out of time. Thanks for your patience.